All right, I'm going to do something a little different this morning just to get us up and get our blood flowing. I'm going to have a little scavenger hunt. So I've got a timer here for 30 seconds. I'm going to turn the timer on when I say go. I'd like for you, if you can, to get up and go find as many shapes as you can. If you don't have any, that's fine. This is just to get us up, get us moving, get our blood flowing a little bit, because I know it's still early and we're probably all a little tired if you're like me. So, all right. So I'm going to start this timer, and as soon as it starts, we can go find some shapes. If it'll cooperate with me here. All right, go. All right. So was everybody able to find some shapes? Cool. Did you get some, Linus? You're on mute, buddy.
Yes.
All right. Good morning, Lariah.
Good morning.
Welcome. All right, can you show me what shapes you got, Linus?
Yes.
What do you got?
It was the shape. Circle.
Circle. Okay. Nice job.
And square.
And a square. So one circle and one square. All right. So
yes.
I found two squares, one rectangle, and four triangles. So if I say I've got one rectangle and two squares, if I'm comparing those, say I've got one rectangle for every two squares. So probably wondering why I said that, but that's going to leave it. Caleb, how many you have? You have three. What kind of shapes did you find? All right, just let me know whenever you get a chance. You write that in the chat. But so the reason I said that is because that's going to lead us into our lesson today. Linus, you had one circle and one square. So your ratio of circles to squares is 1 to 1. Or you have one circle for every one square that you have. So I have one rectangle for every two squares that I have. Okay, so my ratio of squares to rectangles would be 2 to 1, excuse me. So let's go into our lesson. I'm going to share my screen again. Let's give this thing a second to load up. All right. Is anybody else's computer still asleep like mine is? All right, let's try this again. Sorry about this, guys. All right, it's still loading. All right, now I'm going to share my screen again. All right, can somebody let me know when that pops up? You see Unit 2 ratios on there? Linus, when you see it, can you give me a thumbs up?
Yes.
All right, good deal. So that little combo we had about squares and circles and rectangles is going to lead us into this lesson today. And we're going to be talking about introducing ratios and ratio language. So our learning targets for today is 1, I can write or say a sentence that describes a ratio. And 2, I know how to say words and numbers in the correct order to accurately describe the ratio. So let's take a second to look at this picture here. What do you notice? How do you think we can sort these figures out? So if we were to look at them, what do you see that's similar with some of them? How do you think we could sort them out?
Colors.
Say that again, Linus?
Colors.
Colors, that's right. Let me write that on here. Okay, this is not working. So what's one of the colors that you see?
Green.
Yellow. All right, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. We've got green. We've got yellow. What is another color there? Blue. And what else?
White.
White. Now that's going to be hard to draw on a white background. So I'm going to, that black dot there is for white. So how many green shapes do we have? 5, that's right. What about yellow? 5, that's right. What about blue?
4, 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yep. And then what about the white color?
6.
6, correct. All right, so you see what we did there? We can look at this different image of shapes, and then we can pick things out that are similar, and then we can start to categorize them and sort them out based on those characteristics of the shapes. What we just did, we noticed that there were different colors. So we pulled out all of the colors and made categories and sorted them out. And then we counted how many of each of those were. So that gets us thinking about how we might develop some ratios coming up. So let's move on to the next slide there. All right. So this activity is called the teacher's collection. So one of the reasons I went to find those shapes is so we could get our blood flowing and get up out of our seats early in the morning. But another reason was so we could do this little activity. So what we're going to do, we're going to take those shapes that I have. Now, this is going to be difficult because I have to hold them up so you can see them. But we're going to try to sort them out like we just did with that picture we looked at. So how's one way that we can sort these shapes that I held up? What do you think? What's one way you can sort out these objects? What are they? For instance, what is this here? Can somebody tell me?
I can see it. It doesn't come up.
Oh, it doesn't? Oh, okay. Well, that could be a problem then, huh? All right, how about now? You see it now? Can you all see that? Anybody? All right. Well, I'm holding up a square. So one way we can sort these is because we know we've got a bunch of shapes and they're not all the same shape. So we can sort them by shape. So for instance, I've got a square, and if you can't see that, I'm sorry. You can see it on the recording. My computer is not cooperating this morning, but I've got a square, so that can be one category. Then I have a rectangle. That can be another category name. And I also have triangles. So we can make that a category name. All right. So now what do? We count each category to see how many of each we have. So squares, I have 2 squares. Okay. So we're going to put that down here. I have 1 rectangle. And I have 4 triangles. All right, so now we've sorted them, and we're going to look at how to write a sentence that describes the ratios in this collection of shapes that we have. So we can write those in many different ways. One way you see here is the ratio of one category to another category is blank to blank. So let's try the ratio of squares to triangles. Can anybody tell me what that ratio would be? So the ratio of squares to triangles is what to what? Can anybody tell me? We look at our table up here where we sorted them out. So the ratio in this first line, we go with our first category, so it's squares. So we know that that is 2. And in the second blank, we go with our other category, which we know is a triangle. And we know we have 4 of those. So the ratio of squares to triangles is 2 to 4. And the one thing we need to remember when we're doing this, the first category we have needs to be in the first line that we have. The second category that we use needs to go in the second line that we have. So let's do this one down here. The ratio of one category to another category is blank to blank. And you notice in the first sentence, they use the word to. In the second one, they have this colon down here. So you can remember these mean exactly the same thing when we're talking about ratios. This little colon means to, just like it says in the first sentence. So let's try another one here. What shape do you want to use for this first category? Anybody? Anybody want to pick a shape?
Rectangles.
Rectangles? All right.
Yes.
How about the second one? What do we want to use for our second category here? How about triangles again? So if we were going to complete this sentence, the ratio of rectangles to triangles, how would we finish that out? What would these two blanks be? The ratio of rectangles to triangles is what to what?
1.
1. We have one rectangle.
And 4.
4, correct. So the ratio of rectangles to triangles is 1 to 4. How do we know that? We go back to our table. We know we've got one rectangle, and we know we have 4 triangles. So the first category that we chose was rectangle. So we know in the first blank, we need to put how many rectangles we have. So we have 1. The second category that we chose was triangles. And we know that in the second blank, we have to put the number of our second category. And we know we have 4 triangles. So the ratio of rectangles to triangles, again, is 1 to 4. So just remember, whichever category we pick first goes in the first blank, and which category we pick second goes in the second blank. So let's do this last one down here. So we'll pick squares for our first category. Now this is just another way to write this. These all mean the same thing. If we were to use the same shapes in each category the same way, they're just 3 different ways to talk about ratios. Let's use rectangle for our second category. Now you'll notice this sentence is written a little differently than the other two, but it's still the same concept. So in this case, there are blank number of squares for every blank number of rectangles. So Linus, if you remember when we first started, you showed me 1 circle and 1 square. And we talked about you have 1 circle for every square that you have. So in this instance, we go back to our table. We've got our first category. We've got our first blank. So how many squares do we have?
2.
We've got 2 squares. So our second category, we've got rectangles. We've got our second blank here. How many rectangles do we have? 1. So when we're talking about the ratio of squares to rectangles, one way to say that would be there are 2 squares for every 1 rectangle that we have. Okay? So again, when we're writing our ratios out, we sort them by categories, and then we count the number of each category that we have. And we have a nice little table that helps us remember. And then we can write that in 3 different ways. We can either say the ratio of one category to another category is blank to blank using the word to, or we can say the ratio of one category to another category is blank to blank using this colon here. Or we can say there are a certain number of one category for every certain number of another category. So let's move on to the next slide here. Now this one I was going to have you all sort my shapes on your own in a different way, but since I haven't figured this camera thing out quite yet and you can't see my shapes, we won't do this one. I may assign that later when I figure out the camera. But just to summarize what we've done today, we've talked about ratios. And the definition of a ratio is just an association between two or more quantities. So the quantities is just the number of items that we have. So in our case, we looked at shapes. So we know that the category that we were using was shapes, and the quantity of each shape was squares. We had 2, triangles we had 1, rectangles we had 4. So it's just the number of the category that we have. And like we talked about, there are many ways to describe the ratios using those sentences that we talked about. So in this first example, you see the green squares and a circle. So if we were to look at all of these together, we could say that the ratio of squares to circles is 6:3. We've got 6 squares and we've got 3 circles. You see how they used that colon there? They also, we can write it a ratio to circles to squares. So what would we do then? What's the first category that we use? Circles. What's the second category that we use? Squares. So we know that the first category has to go in the first blank. The second category has to go in the second blank. So this time the first category they used was circles. Okay? And the second category they used was squares. In the first example, they used squares first and circles second. So if we're looking back here at the second sentence again about the ratio of circles to squares, we know we have 3 circles. So that has to go in the first blank. And we know that we have 6 squares, and that has to go in the second blank. So the ratio of circles to squares is 3:6. So lastly, we can group these shapes into equal groups. So we split the squares up into 3 groups of 2, and we split the circles up into 3 groups of 1. So if we were to look at these individually, we could say, like in this first one, we know that we have 2 squares for every circle. But if we wanted to reverse that and go circles to squares, we know that we have 1 square for every 2, or excuse me, 1 circle for every 2 squares. So this may be a little difficult at first, but it's just a way of talking about how many objects we have compared to how many other objects that we have. So we'll keep working on that as we move forward. But this is just a way to introduce you all to ratios today. I'm going to show you this picture. I'm going to put this on an exit slip for you all, and I'll post that later. But this is just an image of a collection of dogs, mice, and cats. And then the questions that will be on the exit slip will be about the ratio of these animals to each other. So I will post that shortly. All right, does anybody have any questions for me? I know Linus had to leave early today. Are there any questions? All right, Caleb says no. Lariah says no. All right, like I said, I'm going to post that exit slip here shortly as soon as this video gets finished uploading. And if you have any questions about that, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Send me a private message in our Google Classroom or shoot me an email. But if you don't have any questions for me, you are free to go, everybody.